안녕하세요. 오늘은 미국 영재교육의 쓴소리 제임스 볼랜드 박사님과 함께 영재의 개념 그리고 영재교육과 관련된 문제점과 접근 방법에 대해서 깊이 있게 알아보도록 하겠습니다. 제임스 볼랜드 박사님은 현재 미국 콜롬비아 대학 티처스 칼리지에서 영재교육 프로그램을 총괄하시는 교수님이십니다. 현재 티처스 칼리지 프레스의 영재 시리즈 교육과 심리학 Education and Psychology of Gifted Series of Teachers College Press 편집장이시고 미국과 전 세계에서 강의를 하시고 있습니다. 미국 전역에 있는 많은 학군을 자문을 하셨고요. 수많은 책과 논문을 발표해 오셨어요. 그 중에서 한국에 소개된 책으로는 영재교육의 새로운 이해가 있습니다. 안녕하세요.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you in your lovely studio.
Part 1. Yes or no? 첫 번째 질문입니다. 영재란 것은 특정한 그룹의 사람들에 의해서 인위적으로 만들어진 개념이다. Yes or no?
Yes. Yeah, quite clearly, giftedness is socially constructed. This is reflected in the fact that we have so many definitions of giftedness. If giftedness were something that was out there, that was discovered, that was a fact of nature, after about a century of study, we would all agree on what it is. But what's happened is just the opposite. When this field first started, again, almost a century ago, there was pretty much a unanimous view that giftedness was a matter of having a high IQ or a lot of general intelligence. Since then, definitions of giftedness have gone in many different directions. There's a well-known anthology in the field called Conceptions of Giftedness, and it has 23 different definitions of giftedness, and this is only the beginning. There are many, many more out there. The fact that we can't agree on what this is, the fact that a child can be gifted in one school and not gifted in another, reflects the fact that giftedness is what people make of it. It comes from their ideas, their beliefs, their prejudices. It's not something that's fixed. It's something that we create through our discourse, through our talking, through our reading and writing.
공교육에서 영재교육 프로그램을 제공해야 한다. Yes or no?
Yes, but yes, we have to have these programs. In an ideal world, we wouldn't have gifted education programs. We would have classrooms that would be sufficiently differentiated so that every child's needs are being met on a daily basis. Unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. The world we live in requires that we have these programs as imperfect as they are.
수준별 수업 교수법 Differentiated Instructional Strategies는 실제 상황에서 효과적이다. Yes or no?
Yes, I think, but the problem is that we don't do it. We don't differentiate in our classes. Teachers are very busy. They have many challenges. They have very diverse groups of students, especially in this country. They're trying to meet the needs of different kids, and they can't differentiate to the extent that we would like to see happen. There's not a great deal of research on differentiation. When it is done well, it can be very effective. But the problem is that very few classrooms are differentiated to the extent that we would like to see.
매우 위험한 교육적 이데올로기를 본 적이 있다. Yes or no?
Yes, unfortunately. Historically, one could list a number of dangerous educational practices. I'll just mention one that is rampant these days, and this is high-stakes testing. The use to which tests are put in this country have been, I think, very dangerous. They've crowded important things out of the curriculum. It's teachers and students spend day after day after day preparing to take a test, not learning the things that the tests are supposed to be testing, but actually learning how to take the test. Important things are being thrown aside so that test preparation can be part of the school day, and I think that's very dangerous.
Why do you think that's an ideology?
There's a concern for accountability, and nobody can deny that teachers, along with any other professionals, should be held accountable for their professional actions. They should be monitoring their effectiveness and making sure that our children have the best teachers possible. The problem is that when we boil accountability down into test scores, things suffer. The curriculum suffers. Children suffer. Teachers are judged unfairly. There's a teacher in New York City. Every student in her class received the highest possible score on the test, and she was deemed ineffective because her children made no progress. Because last year, they all achieved the highest possible score on the test, and they didn't do any better than perfect. So because there was no gain, there was no improvement, this teacher is deemed ineffective. This is dangerous.
Part 2! 어느 것이 더 좋을까요? 영재교육을 특수교육 차원으로 접근해야 하는가? 아니면 엘리트 교육 차원으로 봐야 하는가?
I think it's a big mistake to regard gifted education as an honor society. Gifted programs should not exist to reward students or to honor them or to give them recognition. They exist to meet educational needs. Any educational program is justified only if it's addressing needs that students have. So gifted education is a form of special education. It's there to make education more effective for students who, if they did not have these programs, would not be receiving an appropriate education. So honor societies are fine, but that's not what gifted education is about. It's a form of special education. It's something that addresses students' needs in the classroom.
영재성을 키우기 위해서 파트타임식의 프로그램이 더 좋은가? 아니면 과학고, 외국어고와 같이 풀타임으로 접근하는 것이 좋은가? 어떤 것이 더 좋아요?
Well, we really don't know much about pull-out programs. This is the most common form of gifted education in the United States. Not here in New York City, but across the country, most students who are in gifted programs are in part-time pull-out enrichment programs. The problem with this is that we don't have much in the way of data that suggests that these are effective or ineffective ways of meeting the needs of gifted students. The most common form of gifted education really hasn't been tested in the way it should be. And there are reasons for this. There are technical reasons for this. But it's also a test to our lack of will and our motivation with respect to evaluating our programs. Full-time classes, homogeneous classes, special schools have their problems as well. But we do have data that suggests that bringing these children together in a common educational setting does have benefits for these students. I'd have to say that the jury is still out. We just don't know about pull-out programs, but we have a lot of information that suggests that special schools do meet the needs of bright kids.
초등학생이나 유치원생처럼 어린아이들에게도 풀타임 학교를 권장하시는 건가요?
But with younger children, it gets a little more difficult because assessment and placement in programs is more difficult. When dealing with, for example, high school students, by the time they reach would be 9th grade in our country, by the time they're about 14 years old, they have a solid record of academic success, some of them, and we know that they're prepared for high-level instruction. With younger children, we're often basing the grouping or the admission to a special school on an aptitude test, which, as the years progress, becomes a less and less valid predictor of school success. My daughter went to the Hunter College campus schools here in New York City. It's a very well-known school for very bright children, from kindergarten to grade 12. She was admitted to the school when she was 5 years old, largely on the basis of an IQ test score. By the time that she got to high school, that was not a very useful predictor of whether she needed special instruction at all. And in fact, there were other students who then entered the school who were academically very, very strong. And my daughter did well, but it's very difficult to predict at age 4 or 5 what a student is going to need when he or she is 16 or 17 years old. So I think the younger the child is, the more you're making a guess. Whereas with older kids, you can look at their record, you can say, yes, this child is very strong in this subject or all subjects, and you can have much more confidence in placing that child in a school.
Acceleration, 속지는 아이가 수업 내용을 빨리 마스터하면 학년과 상관없이 선행학습을 미리 하게끔 해주는 것이고, 심화학습은 깊이 있게 아이가 탐구, 연구할 수 있도록 도와주는 것입니다. 그래서 교과서 진도와는 상관이 없습니다. 그래서 속지느냐 아니면 심화냐, acceleration이냐 아니면 enrichment냐, 어떤 것이 더 좋아요?
Well, let me first define what those things are. Acceleration can be defined as any administrative arrangement whereby students meet curricular goals at an earlier than typical age or a faster than typical pace. An example of acceleration would be a student skipping a grade, going from grade 4 to grade 6, for example, or entering college earlier than is typical. Enrichment, on the other hand, is providing exposure to content or skills that's not part of the regular curriculum. And this is a common way that we do gifted education. We take students out of the regular classroom and they do something different, something that the other students don't do. We have a lot of data on acceleration. We know that acceleration is effective. We have decades and decades of data that show virtually unanimously that acceleration works, that it's not harmful, and that people's concerns about it are misplaced. As I said before, we don't have data on enrichment. We don't know whether it's effective or not. So given that we don't have those data on enrichment, we do have data on acceleration. I'd have to say that acceleration is, by default, more effective.
In Korea, basically, all students have acceleration instruction.
Mhm.
I've seen so many side effects of acceleration.
Yeah.
So when parents or educators offer acceleration strategy to children, what do they have to be careful about it?
I think what you're describing is something I wouldn't call acceleration. To me, acceleration simply means that students move at a pace that's appropriate for them. It's an unfortunate term because the connotations of acceleration, it's like stepping on the gas, the gas pedal of your automobile and zooming forward. It's not pushing kids, it's just getting out of their way and letting them move at their own pace. We group kids for instruction based on the year of their birth. It's almost astrology. If you're born in the year of the dragon or the year of the rabbit, then that determines what your curriculum is tomorrow in math class or science class or whatever. It doesn't make sense to believe that every child needs the same amount of time to learn the common curriculum. Some students will need more time, some students will need much less time. Some students will come to class already knowing what the teacher plans to teach, and having every child move at the same pace over the same material doesn't make a lot of sense developmentally. It's an administrative convenience. It's very difficult to break that down. But for me, acceleration isn't the kind of thing that you're concerned about, pushing children, which is wrong, but it's just getting out of their way and letting them move at their own pace.
Part 3! 많은 영재교육학자들은 영재교육의 최종 목표를 학생들이 어떤 분야에서 저명해지거나 명성을 얻는 것으로 하는데요. 우수한 것을 높게 평가하는 이유를 이해는 할 수 있습니다. 왜냐하면 이러한 어린이들이 우리 사회의 미래의 자원이 되니까요. 하지만 영재적인 행동을 많이 갖고 있는 분들이 다 명성을 얻으란 법은 없거든요. 예를 들자면 허드센강의 기적의 주인공인 그 비행기 조종사는 자신의 창의적인 문제 해결 능력과 위기 대처 능력으로 수많은 승객들을 살리는 영웅적인 행동을 보여줬는데요. 그분이 비행기 불시착이라는 위기 상황이 아니었더라면 이름이 알려지지 않았을 거예요. 그분뿐만 아니라 훌륭하게 자식을 키우는 영재 부모님들, 영재 만두 요리사, 영재 건설 노동자들은 안 보이는 곳에서 우리 사회를 풍요롭게 하고 있습니다. 우리가 묵묵히 일하시는 이런 분들의 영재적인 행동을 인식하거나 힘을 실어주는 방법이 있을까요?
I take issue with the belief that the creation of eminent people is the goal of gifted education. Some colleagues of mine, Rina Sabatnik, Paolo Olszewski-Kubilius, and Frank Worrell, wrote a brilliant monograph in which they argued that, in fact, that's what gifted education is all about. I thought their work was excellent. I just disagree with that premise. I believe that gifted education is about making education right today for those thousands of students who are not receiving the challenge that they need, who are not receiving appropriate education. I don't think that the goal of the field ought to be the creation of a few eminent people 20, 30 years from now. I think that's a very difficult undertaking. I think it takes our focus away from the here and now, where the real problem is, and the problem that we're trying to address and that we ought to be addressing is found. With regard to those excellent people who are not eminent, first of all, I think there ought to be eminent dumpling makers. In fact, there probably should be a Nobel Prize for dumpling making. That's one of the highest callings I can imagine. I love dumplings. There are a lot of people who are excellent at what they do, and they're not necessarily eminent. There are people out there who are marvelous parents, who are affecting young people in profoundly wonderful ways, who are not recognized. So I think the criterion of eminence recognizes certain kinds of excellence and ignores other kinds of excellence. And in our society, some of the forms of excellence that are recognized are questionable. Not every person who's eminent in the society is a great scientist or a great diplomat or whatever. So I question the whole premise that eminence is what gifted education is all about.
So do you value more personally success or personally meaningful life?
Yeah, I think that success is really self-defined, and that a successful person is one who meets his or her goals, assuming that these goals are consistent with the laws of society and the standards of decent behavior. But I think we all define our own degree of excellence and set our own goals for our lives, and we're successful to the extent that we reach those things. Robert Sternberg talks about successful intelligence, and that's in part defined by one's own beliefs and needs and goals, and I think that makes a lot of sense.
I think you just empowered those quiet heroes.
Yeah.
교수님이 크리에이티비티 포스트에서 뉴욕 또 틀렸다라는 기사로 글을 쓰셨어요. 글을 보면 뉴욕은 도시 전체가 영재 판별을 통한 프로그램을 하면서 불평등 문제가 불거졌다고 하셨습니다. 박사님이 지적한 사회 경제적 불평등 문제가 표준화된 시험, 고액 학원의 과외가 만연한 한국 사회와 매우 비슷하다는 생각이 들었거든요. 한국 교육계가 뉴욕 사례를 통해서 무엇을 배울 수 있을까요?
My feelings about how New York City chooses students for its gifted and talented programs verges on shame. I think it's so misguided and so unfortunate, and I fail to understand why the city persists in choosing students the way they do. Admission to New York City gifted and talented programs is based upon scores on 2 tests given to preschoolers. The results are obvious and they should have been anticipated. In the New York City public schools, about 2/3 to 70% of the students in the schools in all classes are African American or Latino. About 25% of the students in the gifted and talented programs are African American or Latino. It's a wild imbalance, and it's a result of the fact that admission is based on test scores. If you do a search, an online search, for one of the tests that's being used, or either of the tests, the first things that come up on your screen are paid advertisements for test preparation materials or test preparation organizations. So if your family is wealthy and can afford to have you at age 4 go through a test preparation course, you have greater opportunity to score well in these tests. Also, if you come from an affluent family, you're probably going to a good high quality preschool. You're having a lot of experiences that poor children don't have. The tests reflect the inequities in our society, and it's really shameful that the city persists in doing this. Gifted education across the country has a similar problem. It's not as egregious as it is in New York City, but the fact is that wealthier children, Caucasian children, increasingly Asian American children do well in gifted education programs and are highly represented, whereas poorer kids, African American children and Latino children are underrepresented. Not to the extent that they are in New York City, because not all places use tests only, but we have a very bad record going back to the beginning of our history with regard to equity, with regard to representing all of the members of our very diverse society. And New York City is just a classic and really shameful example of how badly we can do things in this field.
To avoid the kind of shameful educational issues, what do we have to do?
Well, let me use again New York City as an example. This is a school system that counts 1.1 million children in its student body, 32 different school districts. But the standards for admission to a gifted and talented class are the same no matter where you live. One simple thing that could be done would be just to norm the tests on a district basis, so that it's irrelevant what your score is with regard to national norms. If you're a child going to a school in New York City, the fact that you score at the 98th percentile nationally means nothing. What really matters is how you score relative to other children in your school. So a child might score at the 90th percentile, which is not high enough to get into a program these days. But if that child is scoring much higher than other children in his or her school, that child needs gifted education. Another child might be scoring at the 98th percentile, and that might be the norm in that school. That child doesn't stand out. That child is not exceptional. That child doesn't need anything special. So one very simple thing would simply be to look at the scores relative to other children in the district, or in the school or the neighborhood. Another thing, even more radical, would be to let each of the school districts in the city come up with its own identification process. The Department of Education, the central administration, could still oversee and approve these processes, but this would reflect the fact that there are great differences from district to district. District 2 on the Upper East Side of Manhattan is very, very affluent, and they send many, many children to the gifted and talented programs. District 7 in the Bronx is a poor district. They send very few. Why each district uses the same identification process makes absolutely no sense to me.
영재가 없는 영재교육을 말씀하셨는데요. 그게 무슨 뜻인가요?
The notion of gifted education without gifted students sounds paradoxical. It sounds like it doesn't make any sense at all. But I think it's worth at least thinking that way, even if only as a thought experiment. I think that we tend to lose sight of what this field is all about. I think too many of us believe that the goal of the gifted education field is to create gifted education programs and to protect these programs and maintain them. But that's really a means, not an end in and of itself. The end of gifted education, the major goal of gifted education, is to provide appropriate education for students who are advanced academically, intellectually, and in other ways. And it might be that gifted education programs are only one means to this end, and maybe not a very effective means. And it might also be the case, and I strongly believe this, that identifying students as gifted doesn't really help us advance their education. What brings these children to our attention in the first place? They're in the classroom. Instruction and the curriculum are not appropriate for them. They're not learning anything. So what do we typically do? Well, we put a label on them. You're a gifted student. We take them out of their class once a week for a couple of hours. We put them in some program where they do who knows what, some form of enrichment. And then we think, okay, we've met their needs. Well, we haven't. We haven't addressed their needs they have in specific school subjects. Moreover, we tend to think they're members of a homogeneous, monolithic group, whereas they all have different needs. Some may be strong in one subject and not another. Some may be strong in 2 or 3 subjects. A few might be strong across the board. But we don't acknowledge that. I think what we need to do is do away with labels and, in an ideal setting, but a very effective one, differentiate our instruction in our classrooms so that if I'm strong in mathematics, I get advanced mathematics instruction. If the student sitting next to me is strong in English and language arts, he or she gets advanced instruction in that area. If the student sitting in front of me is strong in science and social studies, then that's where the advanced academics take place. The term advanced academics is being used by a number of young scholars who wrote a book with that title, and I recommend it highly because it agrees with what I've been saying for a number of years. I always recommend people who agree with me. Identifying kids as gifted just takes us away from what we really should be thinking about, and it's just overly simplistic. And it also has some negative consequences. The inequities that we were talking about before are a result of labeling kids as gifted. I think we could exist as a field quite comfortably without the idea of gifted students.
교수님 글은 어려운 단어가 너무 많아요. 그 어려운 단어를 다 기억하세요? 아니면 교수님이 쓴 책을 다시 나중에 읽어보실 때 사전을 찾아보시기도 하세요?
It has been pointed out to me that I tend to lapse into sesquipedalian usages, obscure words. I read a lot and sometimes the words stick in my mind. You ask whether I have to look things up that I wrote. Not yet, but as I get more senile, that will have to be the case. And I'll forget, what's that word mean? Who wrote that? And by that stage, I'm sure although I'm not sure I'm going to be able to use a dictionary at that age either. But I don't use the word just to show off, but I think sometimes there are very good words that, even if they're obscure, they get the meaning across a little bit better than more common terms.
So, do you have good memory skills or just naturally?
I'm sorry, I forgot the question.
Oh, okay.
I have reasonably good memory. I'm sure it's fading. I'm well into my 60s, so I don't expect that I'm going to maintain it forever, but I try to stay active. Good memory.
Do you study GRE vocabulary?
I don't study vocabulary per se, but I read quite a bit, and I do crossword puzzles. So I know a lot of obscure 3-letter words with 2 vowels, so there are a whole list of crossword puzzle words that show up again and again. So I know that an ort is a food crumb, and that Bobby Orr and Mel Ott were well-known hockey players and baseball players, respectively. Though I knew about baseball. I'm a big baseball fan, so baseball statistics are something I remember too. And I think collecting baseball cards, reading the statistics, following teams from an early age probably has helped my memory. Follow baseball, yes. Well, I want to thank you for the opportunity of being with you today and for asking me these challenging and interesting and stimulating questions. I wish all of you luck in your educational undertakings and everything else. Keep working hard for gifted students and for all students. Keep fighting the good fight, and best of luck to you. Yes, I've been to Korea twice. Once back in 1997 and once, I can't remember the year now, a few years ago. What did I like most? The people. The people were so warm and friendly and so interested in what I have to say. It's very unusual for me to find people being interested in what I have to say. So that was a real treat. What I also liked was the food. I love Korean food.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite cuisines in the world. I love galbi, I love kimchi, bibimbap. What's the thin, spicy pork barbecue?
제육볶음.
That sounds about right. I love the food, virtually anything. A live octopus, which I thought was tasty if a bit scary. Napoleon said that an army travels on its stomach, and by that definition, I'm an army. Wherever I go, I just seek out the food. What shocked me, I won't say, I don't know if it shocked me, but the first time I was there was a drill, a national defense drill, where everything just stopped. The lights all turned red and it just got very, very quiet. And it reminded me of the state of conflict that the North and the South are in, and how close the other country is, and the sense of danger that people live in on a constant basis there. But I love being there. I'd love to go back. I think it's one of the most interesting and delightful places I've visited on the earth.